when we kind of begin looking at some of the things that we will set up for the Reformation. And so as I mentioned last Wednesday, we're going to kind of take each of these time periods in 4 blocks, and we'll do that here to kind of begin. And thinking about what's the political situation in predominantly Europe is where we're going to focus today, because we're kind of leading towards the Reformation, which was largely a Western European type of thing. So politics, culture and society, doctrine, and then practice. And thinking about the politics of the latter Middle Ages, there are a lot of things changing in Western European society. One is the development of a monetary economy. So things like credit and trade and manufacturing, right? These are all things beginning to develop. Now, certainly, there's not going to be this sizable explosion of all this until we get closer to modern times. The Industrial Revolution, of course, changes all of this. But one of the things that begins to occur with this is a power struggle. Because with the development of a monetary economy, there is now the development of the bourgeoisie, or the middle class. Now, as the middle class develops, there begin to be struggles with the aristocrats over issues of authority. Right? Who are these people to tell us how to live our lives? And so the middle class questions the taxes that the aristocrats impose, the power and authority they have. Furthermore, there's a push for, in Western Europe, a strong centralized government instead of these regions controlled by nobles. Now, ostensibly, there is a Holy Roman Empire in Western Europe with a Holy Roman Emperor. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on Wednesday. But locally, people were kind of left to the whims of the nobles. And the nobles controlled a lot of their regions. And so a lot of the middle class wanted to see stronger centralized government. With that is a growing nationalistic fervor. And so toward the latter Middle Ages, into the modern period, we see the development of our modern-day European nation-states. Places like France. England really getting some development as well. Which means that people are starting to develop a national identity. So their identity isn't just based on the local village or city they live in, but that they feel themselves part of something bigger. But that also means there's a commonality here against other nations, right? We are French, we're not Spanish. We are English, we are not French. And so that is kind of starting to break up this Holy Roman Empire, this kind of unified Europe. And as each of these nation-states develop, they have a different view not only of the political power, but of the religious power. And so some of these nation-states are more closely aligned with the papacy, others are more further separated. You also have increased trade, trade routes to the Baltic regions, to China. There's a revival of urban life. Banking begins developing in different ways. Trade guilds, all sorts of things occurring here in the 14th and 15th centuries. One of the other things that has a great social impact in the Middle Ages is the Black Plague. The Black Plague is simply one part of a variety of things that occur in the Middle Ages, the latter Middle Ages. There were several moments throughout the 14th century of economic and social disruption, disease. There's poor harvest and famines in the early 1300s. There's dissatisfaction with the nobles, as we talked about. But eventually the bubonic plague, which it kind of develops in the Baltic regions, makes its way to the west around the mid part of the 14th century. Now, of course, you've probably encountered this somewhere, right? It's carried by the rats. But nobody knows that at the time. And of course, most people in Western Europe had no immunity to the plague, and the medical knowledge of the time is very lacking. It was also referred to as the Black Death, because as people became infected, black blisters formed on these people. Often they experienced the symptoms very quickly: loss of balance, fever, swollen lymph nodes, dementia, and many people died within 5 days. And so it was quick onset, quick death. Between 1347 and 1350, Europe lost a quarter of its populations. Some communities lost up to a third. There were outbreaks every 10 to 12 years or so through the 14th century. Now, this led to a couple of things. I mean, people don't understand what's going on. And so there's a lot of social unrest. Right? It's disturbing the economy, it's disturbing politics, it's disturbing families. All sorts of things are upset by this spread. And of course, with that, there are religious consequences as well. So people begin to have different views religiously about some of these things. One of the consequences of this was the death of the clergy, right? The priests, your local religious leaders. In some places, about half of the clergy had died from the Black Plague. Additionally, so there's that religious consequence. Additionally, there is the return of views of a man named Joachim Fiore. Joachim Fiore had been a monk in the 12th century who had become very interested in studying the book of Revelation. And in his study of the book of Revelation, he had become convinced that history was soon coming to its conclusion. The end of time was upon people. That soon there would be a great battle between the forces of God and the Antichrist, a leader who would rise to fight God's people. And then eventually there would be a period of utopia, right? And kind of after this great battle, the millennium would come, there would be great peace and prosperity. And so with the Black Death, the Black Plague, a lot of people began to return to these prophecies. By 1200, they'd been largely discredited and kind of wiped out. But here in the middle of the 1300s, maybe he's right? Maybe the world is coming to an end. Right? Maybe these are the beginning stages. And so a lot of people began to be reinterested in his views and wonder if he was right about the end of time. A lot of people viewed the Black Death as God's wrath. God had been angry about the corruption of the church, the lack of unity among Christians, the failure of the Crusades to retake the Holy Land out of the hands of Muslims. And so he was extending his wrath to Western Europe as judgment. It also led a lot of people to doubt the truths that they had grown up with, which is understandable in periods like this, where this widespread catastrophe. People begin to wonder, well, if God exists, how can God allow these kind of things? Right? Especially as you see your religious leaders dying, you see your children dying, all of these kind of things. And so a lot of people began to become very doubtful about religion and decrease in religious participation. Furthermore, people turned to alternative sources to try and help ward off the Black Death. Right? They turned to witchcraft. They turned to other attempts to harness magic, other types of superstitious practices, charms, amulets, other types of things, believing that these kind of things would help protect them. Additionally, people believed that religious practices might help ward off the Black Death. And so there was an increase of people traveling to Jerusalem, to other places considered to be holy. Even though Muslims controlled these places, they often allowed Christians to take pilgrimages, guaranteed their safety, depending on who was the leader and who was in charge at various times. And so during this time, a lot of people thought that if they traveled to these holy places, or if they encountered and visited holy relics. Relics were objects considered to be very holy. Sometimes it would be the bones of a particular holy figure. Other times it would be pieces, objects considered to be pieces of the cross. Constantine's mother in the early 4th century, Constantine was a ruler of the Roman Empire who had converted to Christianity. She had gone throughout the Holy Land, Jerusalem, Palestine area, trying to find pieces of the cross, and came back claiming that she had found, this was a piece of the actual cross that Jesus had died on. Some skeptics had suggested that she actually found enough pieces of wood for 3 crosses that were all supposedly part of the cross. But this idea of these holy objects, and if you go and view these holy objects, if you you gaze on them, touch them, there'll be some sort of protection or healing that will occur. So a lot of people turn to those kind of things as well, because the traditional things aren't working. Let's go to these kind of supernatural things. Often, Jews found themselves as targets for blame. You say, well, how did the Jews end up being blamed for the Black Plague? It's unclear exactly why. But one of the things that did seem to be true was that Jews seemed to experience the Black Plague in a much smaller level compared to the Christian population of Europe. Again, not clear why. There have been a variety of suggestions. Some say, well, the Jews had more cats. So the cats killed the rats before they could infect people. Right? So that's a possible explanation. Others have said, well, the Jewish law, with its sanitation requirements about what you do with food and dead bodies and bodily fluids and all that kind of stuff, there were better sanitation practices among the Jewish communities, and that led to this smaller infection. But of course, Europeans don't know that, right? All they know is, here we are experiencing this disease, and the Jews aren't. So unfortunately, Jews were accused of poisoning wells. Right? The assumption was, okay, it's drinking water that's causing this. They were accused of a variety of other things. Some Jews confessed to similar types of crimes under torture. Right? So officials at various places tortured some Jews, and because of the torture, to get the torture to stop, these Jews confessed. Oh, yeah, we did that. Yeah, whatever you say, just stop torturing. And so thousands of Jews were killed during the Black Plague outbreaks because of this fear. Even though several popes issued proclamations, right? They issued statements saying the Jews are not at fault for the Black Death. That still didn't stop that experience. Questions about the Black Plague or the religious consequences? Right? So, that's contributing to this unrest. It's contributing to this religious tension. Furthermore, of course, there are other political things going on, like the 100 Years' War, which essentially starts off as a conflict between England and France, but eventually draws in several other developing nations at the time as well. And a lot of it has to do with the English trying to take control of the French throne, the French trying to help the Scottish. Right? So there's a lot of conflict in all of this. So there's a variety of invasions and all sorts of things. Right? So there's this kind of massive war that is actually longer than 100 years. It runs from anywhere from 1337 to 1453. Some say it's as late as 1475. Either date, of course, is longer than 100 years, but 100 Years' War sounds better than the 115 Years' War. But essentially, this kind of these political tensions going on there. And so, with the economics, the politics, the social instability, people are often open to blaming those in authority. And who's in authority? The church. Right? And so the church bears the weight of a lot of this. Church institutions, land are attacked. In some cases, priests fled from the instability and the disease. Others stood up to serve. Right? So there's kind of this all sorts of things going on here. In the East, however, well, during the 100 Years' War is when we encountered Joan of Arc. I thought I'd move her because you don't really need to know much about Joan of Arc for this class. During this time as well is the sacking of Constantinople. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire at the time, had been starting to break apart since the 1300s. The Turks, which were an Islamic tribe that had developed in the Middle East, are gradually taking control and cutting the East off, especially Constantinople, from the West. The East tried a variety of things to reconcile with the West, right, in an attempt to get help from the West in breaking up this Islamic attack. In 1551, the Sultan Muhammad II begins his last assault on the city. The Byzantine Empire appeared to the west. There's all sorts of attempts of the Pope saying, sure, we'll help you as long as you drop all your Orthodox things and develop and take on our Catholic things. Right? And so the kind of condition is you've got to stop being Orthodox Christians and become Catholics. In April of 1453, Muslims lay siege to Constantinople. The city holds out until the end of May, when it finally falls to Muslims. The city, of course, is later renamed Istanbul.